mini lecture will focus on business communication. Let's first start out by talking about what is communication. Well, communication is really just the transmission of information between a sender and a receiver, and it really only includes a few things. It includes listening and seeking understanding and feedback from the audience so that you can respond appropriately. What you're seeing here is the interpersonal communication process. So communication starts when somebody has something they want to be conveyed or to communicate. So then what they do is they encode the message, or basically they figure out how to send that message. So what are the words I'm going to use to send that message? What how am I going to explain my message? That's what's happening in the encoding process. So I'm trying to create the message so that somebody will understand it. Next, I transmit the message via some communication medium. It could be email, it could be speaking, it could be text, it could be a presentation, whatever it might be. Next, the audience receives that message, and upon receiving that message, they need to decode that message. So basically, in this step over here, the sender encoded it, trying to make sense of the message for the receiver. Here, the receiver is trying to make sense of the message that the sender sent. So they're trying to, so that if the sender says something, they're going to interpret it or perceive it in a certain way. Hopefully, it's decoded the right way. Otherwise, that's where miscommunication happens. Next, if the message was or was not understood, then the receiver might say something like, yep, I've got it, which would be feedback to the sender saying they understand. Or maybe they'll say, I didn't quite understand what you were saying at this point. Could you please describe that? Whereby that would be feedback to the sender, and then they would convey a new message, and the loop would continue. It seems simple enough, but while all this is going on between the sender and receiver, we have literal noise and figurative noise. So noise is literally noise or distractions or sound, but it can also be noise can include thoughts we have in our mind, or it can include the distraction. Maybe you're working from home right now, and you have children that are around, and somebody's talking to you online, but your kids are around, and so you're distracted because you're making lunch, um, and so maybe you don't get the message correctly. And so this is just a very common process that is talked about in the business world. So why do we have ineffective communication in the first place? Well, in this presentation, we're going to talk about 6 barriers to effective communication. One of them is physical. Literally, the physical surroundings can prevent communication. Maybe there is a wall that prevents communication between two people. Maybe the chairs are at different heights. Maybe it's an office setting and the desks are really far apart. But whatever in the physical surroundings can actually inhibit communication. Language. Um, Maybe the two people communicating their native language is different, and so they don't understand everything that's being said, or maybe we're using slang or jargon, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Our body language, so our facial expressions, whether I have my arms crossed or at my side, those all convey meaning um, to the between the sender and the receiver. I'm sure you've all been talking to somebody and they've had their arms crossed and maybe they had a little bit of a frown on their face and you think, they seem really mad. That's a barrier to communication. Our own perceptions. So somebody might tell us something and I might perceive it or interpret it in a way that was different than what the sender meant to say. The organization itself can have processes or idiosyncrasies which can prevent good communication. Maybe maybe it's just that all communication is top down, meaning it comes from the top of the chain to the bottom of the chain, and therefore that's not very effective. Or maybe it's just that there's not a lot of opportunity for feedback within the organization. That could be a barrier to effective communication. And then, of course, cultural. All cultures and subcultures have different communication mediums, which can create barriers. So there's two basic types of communication. One is verbal, the second is written. Verbal communication includes both oral or spoken and written. And we know that written can come in many forms. It can be books, newspapers, emails, memos, just a quick note. And then there's nonverbal communication, which is just as important because it can have an impact on the meaning of your message. And again, we talked about this a little bit. It's your gestures, your posture, whether you're sitting straight or slouching, facial expressions, the tone of your voice, whether you make eye contact or not. And again, this can all be influenced by things like language and culture and some of those barriers that we talked about in the last slide. So part of communication that's really important is listening and feedback. So when we talk about listening, there's a difference between hearing and actually listening. We hear things all the time, but to actually listen, we have to be actively listening. We have to really be paying attention and taking notes, both physically or just in our mind, about what is being said. There's also a concept called empathetic listening. So this is where we listen and we question the other person or people so that we can really develop an understanding of what they're trying to say and what is trying to be conveyed not only intellectually but also on an emotional level so we can understand better. And then giving and taking feedback is very important. From a business perspective, we want to try to give constructive feedback, meaning that when we're working with other people, we want to give feedback that's going to help us to all be better, to all do something better, to be more efficient, to be more effective, versus destructive feedback, which is really just giving, in my really basic words, I would say very negative feedback. Maybe not giving your feedback in a nice tone. Um, I'll give you an example. When I first started teaching, I was told to use the sandwich method. So let's say, for example, that I had a student who wrote a paper and they had very poor spelling. They just weren't a good spelling. They never learned that. I mean, that happens. Some people are good spellers, some just aren't. If I would just say, your spelling is really bad, and left it at that, that's not very constructive feedback. In fact, that's destructive feedback. That's going to make them feel bad. Rather, what I might say as somebody in business or as a manager is, hey, you have some really great content in this paper. I noticed that you have a few spelling errors that could detract the reader from getting your message. My recommendation would be to have somebody help to proofread so that these errors don't take away from what you're trying to say. Can you see how that's much more constructive and provides feedback that can actually help the person rather than just being kind of destructive or not as nice or not helpful. We also have various communication mediums, and I love all these memes I found because it is so true that the type of communication medium or the way that we communicate is very important. So different communication mediums might be texting, memos, reports, email, phone, voicemail. Video conferencing is huge right now. It can be in-person presentations, face-to-face, virtual presentations. There are just so many. I always laugh because I feel like text messages are the number one thing that's misinterpreted. And I think you can see it on here. There's also different types of etiquette. For example, when you send an email, as you can see down here, don't assume that people know who you are and why you're writing. Tell them. So make sure that you choose a good medium for what you're trying to say and that you communicate it effectively. So in order to be an effective communicator, here's some tips. Number one, know your audience. Know who they are. Know their expectations. Know their education level. Know their background, maybe personally or professionally, depending on the context. Be concise. Say what you need to say. Avoid slang and jargon. We all use it, and jargon is really something that maybe we use like an acronym that's very specific to our organization or to our industry that we work in. Try to avoid those because I know that I've been in situations in the business world where somebody uses an acronym and I say, excuse me, what does that mean? So it's just easier if you just say it and describe it. Try to eliminate bias. I hate to tell you this, but every one of us has biases. And biases are preconceptions about members of a particular group. And this can be traditional things like age, gender, race, ethnicity, but it could also be a bias against another department in an organization or or another unit or another company that you work with. So the best thing to do is to acknowledge your biases, and we all have them. And by acknowledging them, we can start to work to eliminate them. And then lastly, use an active versus a passive voice. So you are going to do your assignment versus you did your assignment. All right. So try to use that active voice. That's not the best example, but all I've got for right now. When you're talking about effective written communication, make sure you use the appropriate tone and style. If you're writing a very formal report, you don't want it to be conversational. You want it to be very professional in nature. If you're writing something that you really want to be more emotional or to convey emotions, you might want to use a more conversational style or something that's less professional than that conversational style. Of course, try to avoid grammatical errors. Utilize paragraphs. Each paragraph should focus on one subject. So, for example, if I have students writing a paper and they have to answer 3 questions and I want it in paragraph format, I'll say, I want you to answer these questions, have an introductory paragraph, have one paragraph dedicated to each question, and a concluding paragraph. Your opening paragraph should say what you're going to say, your concluding paragraph should say what you said, and each of the other paragraphs should be 3 to 5 sentences explaining or answering that question. And then use headings and bullets when appropriate, especially if it's a long document. And for business presentations, make sure that, again, you have the right parts of a professional presentation. So again, the opening is what they're going to learn. Sometimes we call it an agenda or what you're going to cover. Then you have your body, which has all your main points. Then you have your closing, which says what you went over. Basically, it summarizes what you went over. And then make sure you leave time for questions, but be prepared to answer questions and be prepared to answer hard questions at times. And when you're delivering the presentation, use visual aids. It can be something like a PowerPoint, but it could also be using a whiteboard or bringing in props, something that's going to be effective to your presentation. Make eye contact, and lastly, practice, practice, practice. All right, that's all I have for this mini lecture. I hope that you now have a better understanding of what business communication is.